I came across a big problem when rendering my Darksiders Death piece. And the problem was I scanned the traditional ink onto my iPad in the hopes that I could Photoshop it or photo edit it so I can put it into Procreate and just start colouring straight away. But the clarity of the scan for some reason didn't work. It wasn't as smooth as I wanted it to be. It was quite edgy, as you could see from the template that I used. And basically I'm just tracing over my own work again. But instead I'm tracing over with clearer lines, more defined edges, and less, I don't know, it's kind of like, it's like as if the scanner picked up the majority of the ink work, but the threshold was too low. It wasn't high enough, or the threshold was too high and it wasn't low enough. Whichever way it was, the threshold wasn't at the right level to pick up or distinguish the black ink with the white paper. So I had to go over it again. And that took enough time as is. I don't even know how much time that took, but it took a lot of time to get there. But finally now, started to colour. And colouring is one of those where I feel sometimes it's a lot more difficult. It's a lot more time consuming. It's a lot more demanding than what inking or penciling is, because that's just the line art. The sketching is when you're building up the volume of the character and you're getting the proportions right and you're getting the structure right. The inking part is when you're fleshing the work out. So you're making the lines more bold, you're making them more prominent, and you're adding other depth of volume within the piece. You're adding the meat onto the bones, basically. And then here comes the colouring, where you're adding the tone work, you're adding the shading, you're adding the lighting, you're adding the effects, the texture, the gradient, all sorts of things you're thinking of doing. From cast shadows to occlusion shadows, to reflective edges, to bouncing light, to just all sorts. I could try and tell you all the theories of light, but there's only like 7, I think. There's 7 theories of light, and there's another 7 theories of shadow, which eludes me a little bit. I don't remember them all, but somewhere in my head I remember them. But out loud speaking them, I have to refresh my mind and go back on my material. But learning all that is a very key element to getting this piece look more realistic, looking more lifelike, looking more alive, like I said previously. But the reason this takes the longest as well is because you have to, in a way, you have to render it in your mind before you draw it. You have to know what you're looking for before you even put pencil to paper, or in this case, digital pencil to iPad. You need to know what to do before you do it. And that can be a hard task. Knowing what to do before you do it, it's not easy. Whether you say to yourself, is this a cast shadow? Is this a occlusion shadow? Is this the termination point of a shadow? Is this a reflective surface of a shadow? Is this the bouncing light that lightens the one side more so than the middle? And so on and so forth. Mapping that in your head is probably the most time consuming of it all. But if done right, if done well, that really makes the piece stand out. And it's what really makes it come to life. Now, I don't even know how many hours I've been working on this one. On this piece, on this colorization of death. I can tell you easily it's probably been over 40 hours. Unfortunately, and this will be a video at a later point, I came across a very dry spell with my work. I wasn't really motivated to do much. Partly to do with, that's what happens when you take a break sometimes. Sometimes you take a break and you really enjoy, I hate to say doing nothing, because you're always doing something. And then when you're doing nothing, it's such a nice break to just be able to relax, let your mind rest, and just let it loosen. Because for me, burnout, a big part of burnout is when my mind's really tight, it's wound up and it's just constantly going. But part of me wants to do more, but the other part knows if I do more, I'll burn out. But that is another video for another day. I will go more into that when I get the chance. But colouring, yes, it is the most difficult and the most rewarding. You can only imagine like what artists like Michelangelo, when they did the Sistine Chapel, my goodness, all the hard work to map it out, and then the proportions and the colouring, especially the rendering, the realistic rendering of something like that, will always take the longest. It'll take longer than the planning. It'll take longer than the proportion measuring. It'll take longer than every other part of it. It's the colouring that takes the most time. And it always has, because multiple layers are involved all the time. You have to start off with your base layer. Then you got to continue building and building and building, put in your light tones, your dark tones, your reflective tones, and even special effects if you're going down the way that I am. So that's another element on top of that. But also trying to capture the same mood, the same tone as that character. When you're inking or when you're colouring, especially when you're colouring, inking less so because you're going off of your sketching, but it still influences it. All of it, this includes everything, but colouring is particularly the most important one when it comes to this. When you're colouring in your piece, you really have to nail down the mood of that character, the tone of that character. You have to capture it all in one thing, the colouring, because you can't capture it any other way. You're not an animator. We're not animating. We're not making this moving. There's no speech involved in it. There's nothing apart from the appearance of it. And you've really got to nail down that character's attitude, that character's personality. And if that character is a particular character who's very dark themed and sinister, like Death, you have to really nail down that dark themed and sinister emotion with the colouring and the way you colour. A brilliant example, and I personally think this is my favourite part, is his mask. It's very bone, it's very ivory, it's very gritty, it's very textural as well. And the eyes play a part in this. And I got that down to a T in my opinion. But the colouring really emphasises that. And I think that's what's made this part of my work the most successful, because of that tone that I got just right. Now, everything else falls into place because once you get an idea of it, it just naturally flows through you. But you must keep up this mentality of, I know what I'm going to do before I do it. And if I don't know what I'm going to do before I do it, sometimes that's when I mess around, I test things. Like here, you're seeing me put something down and I'm like, no, I'm going to erase that, I'm going to redo it again, and seeing what works. Because I know roughly what it's going to look like. I just don't know exactly how to put it down on paper, or in this case on my iPad. But that's when experimenting is needed. You can't see sometimes it's hard to explain. It's like you know the path, you see it, but you just don't know where exactly it's going to take you. Until you visualize it, that's when you know it's going to take you. For another example, it's like when you're driving down a road, you should know where it takes you, but you don't know where it's taking you currently until you recognize that certain part and you're like, yes, I know exactly where I am now. From here, I know exactly where to go. And an even better example, again, using driving or traveling as an example, is when you're so used to going in a certain direction on a road, but then you take the reverse direction. You're like, this does not look familiar whatsoever, but it's the same road. You're just taking it reverse. Same when it comes to colouring. You're trying out a road, you're seeing if it works or if you recognise it. If it aligns with the knowledge that you possess in your mind currently, to see if it lines up with it. If it does, great, fantastic, we're on the money. But if it doesn't, you can always try again. That's the good thing about digital art. You can always try again. It's even more so difficult when traditionally doing it. If you want to learn like the principles of shading, test it out and things like that, Learn your traditional stuff. Learn how to color. Learn how to render. But also, if you're not too sure about something, do it digitally first. Because you can always erase it and go back to it. But here's the catch. If you do it digitally, you don't learn as fast as you do traditionally. Because traditionally, you place more pressure on yourself to get it right than you would do digitally. There's no back option. There's no rewind the clock. There's just simply, you make a mistake, you've got to find a way to fix it. And if you can't, it's ruined for good. That's how it goes, unfortunately. You learn digitally, you learn it with less restrictions and more comfort. You learn it traditionally, you learn it faster. You teach yourself quicker on how to do it with the pressure of not making a mistake. So it depends on which way you want to go first. But I always recommend, before you get too comfortable with a tablet, or even if you get comfortable with a tablet, always remember that the tablet is mimicking a form of art, normally or typically done traditionally. It's not mimicking anything else. It is mimicking the traditional artist. Therefore, you should draw it in somewhat a traditional method. Sure, you got all these tools to help you, but you need to learn the traditional way first. Because if you don't, you might make phenomenal pieces in such a short amount of time. But the problem is, once you step away from that medium, that's it. You find it infinitely more difficult because you're depending on things that you can't use traditionally, that you can only use digitally. So learn it traditionally first if you can. If not, do a bit of both, but always try and learn it traditionally first. Because all an iPad and an Apple Pencil, or all a Wacom tablet with a Wacom pencil is doing, is mimicking a traditional artist. So always focus on that, and then everything else will follow through.